Okay.
Okay.
Good evening. Good evening to all. And I'm very pleased to present you alumni of our university, Anke Klitzing. This is a lecture at the Technological University in Dublin in the School of Culinary Arts and Food Technology on food and culture, media and communication. Her PhD research focuses on developing the paradigm of gastrocriticism, the theory and methodology of understanding the nexus of food in writing. And she combined experience in management, hospitality, with a rich knowledge of food, culture, media, literature. She had lived, worked, and studied in Germany, Ireland, Italy, also naturally, USA. Sorry, yes, United States. Then thank you very much, Anke, for your interesting conference. And then it's possible to begin to 35 minutes for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo. Let me just see if I can, how does it work with the file sharing? Do I click on this or do you see it or how does it work with
And
the
I think that you have you the possible to condivision file.
Okay, can you see this?
Okay, perfect, very good.
Okay, perfect. Okay,
Perfect.
guys,
Thank you.
I'm going to start into it. So thanks again for Paolo for inviting me and for introducing me. My name is Anke Klitzing, and I'm going to talk to you today about food in literature. And actually, the first two slides are introducing me again, so bear with me if you're sick of hearing the same thing over and over. So, as Paolo already said, I'm a lecturer at the Technological University in Dublin, in Ireland. I teach modules on food and culture, literature and media, as well as food studies research. I'm about halfway through my PhD on food literature and gastrocriticism, which I explain in a second. And I'm about to publish my second journal article on the topic. I studied in the University of Gastronomic Sciences between 2009 and 2012. I did a one-year master's in English language and transferred into the second year of the Laurea Magistrale. And before moving to Italy to do my master's, I was working in bars and restaurants around Dublin in Ireland, and where I also got my bachelor's degrees in English literature and sociology. And after studying in Colorno Polenzo, I moved to Berlin in Germany, where I worked as the director of communications for Slow Food Germany for a couple of years. And that was certainly very interesting work. I was writing and talking about food in all sorts of different formats. I was writing speeches for the Slow Food Germany president. I was tweeting. I was writing press releases. I was preparing brochures, giving TV and radio interviews, wrote magazine articles, and came up with hashtags. So very broad. And of course, I met many people across the whole range of the food system: producers, consumers, scientists, students, politicians, activists, chefs, and many, many more. But after a while, I realized that my particular interest, my own interest, the one that I wanted to follow up further through research, was actually around food writing, and especially literary food writing, probably influenced by my longstanding other passion besides food, that of literature. And that's when I decided to pursue a PhD as well as a career in academic teaching and research. Because you see, literature and art in all its forms, but obviously I'm going to talk about literature, is not the same as communication. It can't be understood by the tools of social science or media studies. Unlike media text, literature is usually not instrumental. It doesn't have a purpose outside itself. It doesn't try to communicate, inform, or persuade, but its purpose really is, let's say, to enlighten, or sometimes also to entertain. The English essayist Thomas de Quincey, he said he distinguishes between the literature of knowledge and the literature of power. So in general, writing that informs us versus writing that moves us. Literature of knowledge may be texts that are useful and poignant right now, whether news or academic articles, but as knowledge increases and time passes, they become somewhat obsolete. Literature of power, on the other hand, stays relevant, even if the social, political, or intellectual circumstances change. Shakespeare is still relevant today. Ezra Pound, who's himself both an author and a scholar of literature, said literature is news that stays news. So when we want to study literature, the literature of power, it needs to be studied and understood in its own particular way. And generally that is through literary theory and literary criticism. And before I bridge the gap between literary theory and studies and gastronomy, to better understood why this is important and why it's important to define specific ways of studying literature, so questions of methodology and epistemology, as they say, a very quick look at academic disciplines. And you're probably familiar with this, but I just, it will help to kind of explain where I'm coming from and what my PhD is actually doing. So there are clearly a lot of different academic disciplines or fields of study, but fundamentally there are three large categories. We have the natural sciences, such as biology, chemistry, physics, and the many subdivisions and specializations that you can have there. We have the social sciences, anthropology, geography, political science, sociology, and again, many subdivisions and specializations. And then we have the humanities or arts, where we have the visual or performing arts, literature, languages, philosophy, history, and law, although some parts and subspecializations of history and law are also social sciences. It really depends on the specialization. And what distinguishes these three large categories from each other, but unites them sort of within each other, within the category, is really the focus and method of their scholarly inquiry or research. So the natural sciences, they're focused on real-world objects and real-world phenomena. And their study, their research methodologies are lab experiments, field experiments, generally observation, trial, and error. Of course, there's very detailed, specific methods to study, but broadly, this is how they can be summed up. Social sciences focus on human subjects, and their methodologies would be interviews, surveys, focus groups, direct interaction with humans, observing social interactions, sometimes also the traces they may leave in texts, etc., like shopping lists or newspaper articles or tweets or things like this. Humanities and arts focus on texts and theory, and specifically on texts that are creative texts, or they're created with a specific purpose rather than casually or coincidentally. And the research methods there are critical or speculative inquiry. And you may be already thinking, now where does gastronomy and food studies belong? First of all, I should say that gastronomy and food studies, they're slightly different fields, but very, very similar. And for the purpose of my talk, I'm just going to lump them or treat them as conjoined twins or interchangeable. Gastronomy or food studies are interdisciplinary. That means they're breach disciplines. They use a wide variety of methodologies and theory. Some drawn from social sciences, some drawn, some from anthropology, some from history, etc. And food studies, which became its own field really in the last 30 years, has very strong roots in social sciences. So there's, seminal work by people like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Mary Douglas in anthropology, Norbert Elias in sociology, Pierre Bourdieu as a semiotician, etc. And in the last 20 or 30 years, there's increasingly also been inquiry into food through humanities, methods, and focus. There's also some influence of natural science methods in this cultural study of gastronomy. So I'm thinking of, for example, the book you see in the bottom right-hand corner here, Charles Spence, Gastrophysics. They're breaching sort of the gap between natural sciences and food and culture or gastronomy. So there's this element as well. And so how can we now study food in literature? we just talked about this, humanities research in food studies. And so we're at the intersection now of the question of how to study food and gastronomy in literature. And this is where I'm working with my PhD research. What I'm trying to do is actually to describe a particular research methodology of food and literature, which I called gastrocriticism. Not actually my word, it was coined by Professor Ronald Tobin in 2002, but I'm working on how to describe and define it. And this is a form of literary criticism that focuses specifically on the human relationships to each other and the natural world through food. And it looks at food in literary writing through a culinary lens, which is informed by insights from food studies research. So, as I would define it, gastrocriticism is informed by the concepts and insights of gastronomical scholarship and food studies. It pays particular attention to the role gastronomy plays in literary writing, and it is based on the understanding that literature writing and human behavior around food and eating reflect and shape each other. Okay, so this is what I consider this new approach, or this approach of actually properly understanding food in literary writing, and through that more about food and more about writing. And while I hope to contribute some original research to the world, I'm not the first to work in this field. There's been a growing interest in this intersection of literature and food, or food studies, since about the year 2000. So on the right-hand side here, you see some seminal works there, literature and food studies, literature and foods, Routledge Companion, Cambridge Companion, etc. And there's also on the left-hand side, you can see some examples on, there's many anthologies of food writing, collections of food writing out there as well. So there's definitely a growing interest in this interaction of the two topics, as well as growing scholarship thereof. And they all look at this interplay of food and literature, food in literature, food literature, and food writing. And you can see there's a whole tanglement of terms here. So this is something to disentangle. And I think maybe we can start by looking at the history of food in writing. Briefly. When it comes to writing about food, there are some genres of writing that are specifically food focused. The main ones I would say are recipes, cookbooks, as well as restaurant reviews, that sort of thing. And they're very old as well. Like recipe writing has been around at least since 1750, before the Common Era. You can see the top right hand there is this stone tablet from Babylonian stone tablet, which features recipes. And this year people are still interacting. During the lockdown, somebody actually recreated the recipes from the stone tablets, which were for fun. So they're actually usable as well. They're proper recipes. Cookbooks as recognizable recipe collections have been around at least since Roman times. Maybe you're familiar with Apicius. And even some of the early printed books were on cooking. So we have Platina, published in 1470. In Germany in 1485, there was one published called Küchenmeisterei. So again, writing and publishing on food is actually quite old. But obviously recipe writing isn't storytelling, isn't a narrative in it. It's very technical, instrumental, and sparse. There's certainly art in cooking, and you could also argue that a recipe tells a story, but the writing itself is, I wouldn't call it literary. The first restaurant review, again, this is probably something you're familiar with. The first restaurant review, the first restaurant critic was Grimaud de la Reynière, who initially was a theater critic, and from 1803, for about 10 years, he published his Almanach des Gourmands. And that's just a mere 40 years after this new business model of the restaurant emerged in Paris. But it's important to see as well that it wasn't just a new business model of these particular spaces that were not like a tavern, but very elegant, etc., etc. It's also a new form of a cultural product. A restaurant, a place where you go to enjoy the food, not to get full, but to fill your belly, but to actually have this experience of a restaurant meal. And the fact that a theater critic began to critique restaurants and meals points to the fact that it wasn't just about making money as a business or filling one's belly as a customer. And not long after, we have the famous Physiology of Taste by Jonathan Brillat-Savarin. I'm sure you're familiar with him, who focuses, first book ever to focus on this idea of gastronomy as both a cultural endeavor and define this idea of gastronomy as he writes, the intelligent knowledge of whatever concerns man's nourishment. So an intellectual cultural endeavor rather than just a business model or a basic biological necessity. Now, obviously, recipes, cookbooks, restaurant reviews, they're undeniably about food. But the question is, are these texts literature? And for example, we heard about De Quincey's idea of the literature of power. Or is there powerful, quote unquote, literature on food? And how can we understand such literature? The classical understanding or categorization of literature is that there are three major genres: poetry, prose fiction, and drama. And then in the late 20th century, there are a growing number of scholars who say there's actually a fourth genre called literary nonfiction. And what these literary writings have in common, what makes them literary, arguably, now the details are hotly debated by literary scholars, but in general we can say literary texts tell a story, they have a narrative. They use literary devices such as metaphors, dialogue, action, things like that. In that they use something called heightened language. Language is very aware of itself. It's chosen very purposely in terms of rhythm, syntax, the words, allusions, metaphors again, etc. And De Quincey would say literature moves us emotionally, whatever, and that's where its power lies, etc. And when it comes to food in literary writing, you might say, of course, there's food in literature. Food is a fundamental part of life. It's one of our first biological needs. Everyone eats and must eat. But nothing in literature is coincidental. Everything is there for a reason. Somebody purposefully put something onto a page. Literary characters aren't real people. They don't have to eat. So if they do, it has a reason. Now, food in literary writings of any type can have very basic functions. It can just tell the time by telling us it's breakfast, or can give a bit of a realistic setting, etc. Yes, that's one thing. It can be highly symbolic, where it's not about an actual realistic setting, but if you think about, for example, Adam and Eve and the apple in the Garden of Eden, highly symbolic, has nothing to do, again, with being hungry or anything like this. But there's a third model, basically, or third thing, where there are narratives where food has an active presence, you could say. There's a American professor called Jeff Birkenstein that says, they called it significant food. And this is food where, when food is used as a significant literary device, it's part of the plot. It's important for the characters, the setting. It might play in a restaurant. The characters might be a chef, or all sorts of variety there. And without food, the story would not be the same. And that's basically this idea of significant food. And you can find this type of significant food in all sorts of literary genres. Back in mythology, poetry, prose fiction, drama, literary nonfiction, and then the specific food-focused texts, obviously, as well. For example, as they're collected in these food writing anthologies, etc. And this is not a new thing. The tradition of significant food in literary texts and stories is really old. Even if you ignore Eve for a second, because she's really like symbolic. But in the Bible, there are many stories where food is very significant. And an example would be Esau and Jacob, and the lentil stew that cost Esau his right of the primogeniture, his first right as a firstborn. there's many layers of symbolism in this, but stewed lentils would have also, among other things, would have been a very typical dish for that time and place. Ancient Greece, we have Homer and his stories, and they're full of reference to feasts. But not only that, he actually gives very specific details of how to roast a joint of meat and how to prepare a wine-based drink for the feast. So nearly recipes, not quite, but nearly that. Very realistic, and about the food rather than the symbolic meaning behind it. In Irish mythology, you have some major stories that focus on food-related things. There's the Cattle Raid of Cooley, or the Salmon of Knowledge, where the hero, Finn McCool, he acquires wisdom by being the first to taste this particular fish, and he actually licks his thumb after touching it while cooking. Then we have, in the Middle Ages, we have this one story that comes up in different countries under different names, but it's always the same sort of thing of a magical country where the landscape and the buildings and even the animals are actually made of food. So the Land of Cocaine in English, Aisling McConglin is the story in Ireland, Schlaraffenland is the German version, and I think it's the Paese della Cuccagna in Italy, and maybe there are other versions as well that I'm not even aware of. Jumping ahead to the modern era, so post-Renaissance, and particularly since the Enlightenment, in the modern era, the human imagination has focused ever more on the real world, and more importantly, sought and found this power to move us, not in the spiritual connection, but within humanity and human society. And there are two literary movements in the early 19th century that are very much important about this. So Romanticism in Britain and Transcendentalism in the US. And food and eating incidentally plays an important role for several writers in these two movements. Not so much gluttony and feasting, but vegetarianism and virtuous eating in harmony with nature. And several writers in both countries were involved in social experiments and self-sufficient livings, like communes and things like this. Still about, it's less food and it's virtuous food, but it's food all the same. Later in the 19th century, we have realist novels, and they're bursting with scenes of food and eating. So Dickens, for example, and he has Oliver Twist's Empty Bowls, or the Christmas feasts, or many other scenes where food plays a big role. We have in France, we have Zola's Belly of Paris, which is a novel that's set in and around the teeming central market of Paris. In the US, we have Walt Whitman, young country in the United States in very rich ways. In the early 20th century, does it jump? Come on. Yeah, there we go. In the early 20th century, there's a literary movement, modernist literary movement. And here the modernist writers, they moved away from this idea of the teeming life out there and focused on the interior life, and very much introspective, and sometimes they applied a prism of food and eating through the introspection. Famous examples, we have Virginia Woolf and the famous beef stew into the lighthouse. James Joyce's Ulysses is full of food scenes, both for time markers and through all sorts of layers of meaning. William Carlos Williams has a very famous poem where he's apologized for eating the plums from the icebox. T.S. Eliot writes about tea and cakes and ices in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So food often becomes, as I said, a prism through which this interior introspection is actually played out. Around the time of the modernist writers, the height of the modernist movement is also when M.F.K. Fisher started to write. Maybe you're familiar with her already. And she kind of took this modern introspective tendencies and also the trend for expat living and moving to Europe, and she combined that with Brillat Savarin's Gastronomical philosophy. She actually translated his book into English, and she wrote some of the finest prose ever written about food in the English language. And maybe one of her most famous texts is the foreword to this book, The Gastronomical Me, where she justifies why she writes about food and not about love or death, etc. And she says that it seems to her that our three basic needs for food and security and love are so mixed and mingled and entwined that we cannot think straightly of one without the others. There's a communion of more than our bodies when bread is broken and wine is drunk. So writing this in 1943, she kind of preempts what scholars and food and gastronomy scholars have argued since in many texts and many studies, that eating is not just a physical act and a necessity, but also a social and cultural and imaginative act and necessity. One that is highly charged with meaning, both on our real plates and on the page. The anthropologist Arjun Appadurai calls food a condensed social fact because of its cultural and interpersonal significance. And MFK Fisher's work is still a beacon of literary food writing, but she was by no means the last writer to take on this culinary lens as a writer and for their work. Since the 1980s, there's been an upsurge in food-focused writing, literary writing. We have the filmmaker Nora. She wrote an autobiographical novel called Heartburn. It's a novel, but it includes recipes as well. Ruth Reichel, who was a New York Times food critic, wrote several memoirs, and they sort of weave around her professional and private eating. There's an example of Monique Truong, The Book of Salt, which is a straight-up novel, but it uses food and cooking and eating to embody all sorts of layers of meaning. And then, for example, Michael Pollan combines journalism with storytelling and autobiographical detail, to great success, basically. And these are just a few of many literary style narratives with strong gastronomical sort of vibes. And gastrocriticism as a method of inquiry investigates not only the symbolic, but also the actual social and cultural significance of food as it appears in literary text, whether they're specifically written about food or just are rich in food. And to give you an example of what such a gastrocritical inquiry looks like, I'd like to share with you some insights I gained from writing 2 papers on the Irish Nobel laureate poet, Seamus Heaney. The first one, I was looking at food and foodways in general in his poetry, and in a second, I focused specifically on Irish food and cuisine. And I'm just going to give you, I could talk for hours, but I'm just going to give you a couple examples. So in case you're not familiar with Seamus Heaney, he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. He's from Derry in Northern Ireland. He writes a lot about farming life and everyday life, and there's a lot of farming and food-related scenes, and people studied him as a nature poet, but not really in terms of food and foodways. So this is where my work comes in. And what I did is I looked at poems where foodways are central to the text, so where there's significant food in the entire span of his collections. And I found there's a lot of gastronomical themes in Seamus Heaney, from Irish cuisine to things like hunting, fishing, foraging, farming, material culture, transformation of nature into culture and food through human labor, communal individual identity, and then things like commensality, conviviality, appetite, and then the famine, which is obviously the great Irish famine from the 19th century. A very important part of Irish history that still has consequences today. Just a few examples then. As I said, I'd love to talk to you for hours about this, but just pick a few. So this idea of transformation through human labor. Most of what we eat is created through agriculture, which is culture, which is cultivated, it's not natural. But even then we have raw materials, which then we apply cultural processes to transform them from nature and raw ingredients into food. And you see some of this in Seamus Heaney's poetry. So the two pictures you see there, they look really empty, and this is bog, this is swampland in northwest Ireland. But this is where they found Stone-aged fields, 5,000 years old. And Seamus Heaney wrote about these in the first poem there. This is just an excerpt. He wrote, "They were the first plough marks, the Stone-age fields, a landscape fossilized, its stonewall repatternings repeated before our eyes." So he draws attention to the fact that there's, first of all, the first plough marks changed the landscape forever. Although it looks quite untouched, they're still, the landscape is completely changed to what it was before humans came there. And also the stone walls that you see nowadays patterning in west of Ireland, actually the same that that you can see, that you would have seen 5,000 years ago than now, under this blanket of bog there. Another poem he has is about making butter, churning butter. And he writes, "Suddenly a yellow curd was waiting the churned up white, heavy and rich, coagulated sunlight that they fished dripping in a white tin strainer, heaped up like gilded gravel in the bowl. And in the house we moved with gravid ease, our brains turned crystals full of clean deal churns, the plash and gurgle of the sour breathed milk, the pat and slap of small spades on wet lumps." And here we have the transformation of, on the one hand, cream into butter, which is highly nutritious, also highly valuable. And so he calls it coagulated sunlight, gilded gravel. He likens it to gold. And if you know about Irish food history, you know that dairy products were actually, before the potato, that were the main calorie. That's where the majority of the calories came from. So it was extremely valuable. It keeps for a long time. But it's not just the transformation of the natural product into food. It's also transformation of the people through the labor, because churning is a rhythmic activity that has to be done over a long time, and everybody in the family takes part, and it's sort of like a ritual dance, and it changes them. Their brains turn to crystal. It's like a ritualistic dance, for example. We have examples of commensality or conviviality. In Oysters, he writes about toasting friendship, laying down a perfect memory in the cool of thatch and crockery, eating with your friends. In Eelworks, it's a long poem about eel fishing, and he talks about the fact that sometimes when you eat with others, there's a challenge you have to overcome. So he writes, "To win the hand of the princess, what task the youngest son had to perform. For me, the first to come a-courting in the fish factor's house, it was to eat with them an eel supper." So, being invited to eat with a family, it's the first step to be invited into the family. But sometimes you have to then deal with things that are strange to you, that might be, maybe you've never eaten eel. It's not exactly a food that you might eat all the time. It's a bit strange for some people. So what task the son had to perform, and he encapsulated this human experience very well. The last part here is from a poem called Casualty, and it's just a tiny bit of a large poem. And he writes, "Swimming towards the lure of warm lit up places, the blurred mesh and murmur drifting among glasses in the gregarious smoke," which I think this is a charming encapsulation of what a pub is like. What it's warm, it's gregarious, it's luring you in, especially if it's cold and wet outside, as it often is in Ireland. But there's many meanings to this as well, or the poem itself tells a story. It's called Casualty, and the casualty is a man that Seamus Heaney knew, it was his habit to go to the pub in the evenings, but on that fateful evening, there was actually this set in the 1970s during the Troubles, which is the sort of the civil war, or the war for civil rights in Northern Ireland, a lot of bombings and killings. And actually, this person went against the curfew, and the pub where he went to was bombed, and he died. But this encapsulates both this the gregarious pub, but then also the black side of Irish history, or this black chapter of Irish history. Not all of Irish history is black, and some of Irish Seamus Heaney's poetry shows other parts of Irish, very much food-related Irish history. So there's one called The First Kingdom, where he writes, "The royal roads were cowpaths. The Queen Mother hunkered on a stool and played the harp strings of milk into a wooden pail." And this might seem sort of pejorative against, you know, how can you be a queen if you have to milk a cow? But if we look at Irish history, you realize, again, before the English really came, cattle was the wealth. If you had cattle, you were wealthy, and dairy products was like sort of the main staple of the Celtic Ireland. So the royal wards were cowpaths. This is actually quite true. Cattle are still important, but modernization plays its part as well. So Seamus Heaney's fathers and uncle were cattle traders, and he writes, "Father, I've watched you sadden when the fairs were stopped. No room for dealers if the farmers shopped like housewives at an auction ring." So he talks about the personal identity of the cattle trader, the changing of the economy over time, what it does to the individual, etc. So there's a lot going on in a few lines. And just another thing about food habits, about making should be slow gin, not slow as in slow food, but slow as in the fruit there. So the clear weather of juniper darkened into winter. She fed gin to sloes and sealed the glass container. And when you put sloes into gin, this gin, the clear gin, actually turns dark and red. So there's some poetic meanings to these lines. And a last topic, just to briefly talk about, that, you know, it's left such a huge mark on Irish history, and it's obviously food related as well, which is the Great Famine of 1845 to 1849, which reduced basically over that and the next 10 years or so, it reduced the Irish population by half through death and emigration. And it's not just plain dying, it's also the, you know, starving people being humiliated and losing their very humanity. And Heaney encapsulates this in two poems. In the first one, he talks about the disenfranchised humans who he likens to different animals: crows attacking crow-like fields, skulls that are wolfing down the blighted roots, that grub like plants in the bitch earth, his words. So being hungry and being completely out of, you know, have no control over their food turns humans into animals, turns them back into nature rather than culture. In another poem on the famine, it's written from the point of view of a boat commander who came across, British at the time, who would have come across a boat of starving Irishmen, and refused to give them food. And the commander writes, "We'd known about the shortage, but on board they always kept us right with flour and beef. So understand my feelings and the men's who had no mandate to relieve distress. There was relief available in Westport, though these poor brutes would clearly never make it." So you have this juxtaposition of the official line of like, we have no mandate to help you. So, you know, they're distancing themselves from the inhumanity, from the actual catastrophe, by saying, well, we're not allowed, the government tells us differently, etc. And it's a very powerful poem in its very simplicity. So with this talk, I wanted to kind of show you a little bit about, introduce you to this topic of gastrocriticism as a method of inquiry, focus on food and literary writing. And Terry Eagleton, an English critic, says food looks like an object, but it's actually a relationship. And gastrocriticism is looking at exactly this point, not just something that's casually and in the background, but it's in the very nature of human relationships. And I would say that food is as it says, was a rich prism through which we can understand literature better, but literature is also a tool to understand more about food and foodways. If you have poets like Heaney telling us what it was like, etc. And through both, we can learn more about what it is to be human. So thank you. That's my talk. Thanks very much.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Anke, because it's true. For me in particular, I am a degree in literature, Italian literature, and then I think that is very important this relationship between food and literature is in connection, very, very important for the food, for culture, and for understanding human being, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then is possible for students, not many students, but very good students, about this possible to do any questions to Anke, please, for the questions. Asia, Audrey, Erika, Khalid, Nicole. Okay, Khalid, please. You read, Anke?
Sure, okay.
Okay, good.
So thank you for your talk. You mentioned literature of knowledge and literature of power. For food literature to be moving, does it mean that food has to be used as a tool for symbolism and realism and not to be the main theme of writing? I read somewhere that the best food writing is not about food. Well, this is, yes, I would totally agree that the best food writing is not about food, but I think the best food writing understands that food itself isn't necessarily about food. You know, food is always about, there's always a social human angle to food. You know, food, we don't, Roland Barthes says we haven't lived just lived off food as it comes in nature since we moved since we stopped living off berries. Food is produced through agriculture. Food is prepared. Somebody prepares the food. There's choice every time we eat something. We make choices about what we eat. Where does it come from? Where do we buy it? How do we prepare it? Is it a traditional recipe? Is it a modern recipe? And all of these things. And I think the best food writing understands all this and talks about that. So really talks about human relationships through the food. And it doesn't have to be anything, when you say, does it have to be symbolic? It doesn't have to be anything beyond what it is, because the point is, food is already symbolic. You know, there's a difference. If I invite you to my home, there's a difference if I prepare a dish that my granny taught me, or if I buy something from the shop, just, you know, casual, I don't know, frozen pizza. You know, there's so much going on in food itself that I think that the best food writing, well, first of all, you don't have to necessarily go symbolic. And then the idea, food writing that just talks about food gets boring really quickly. You know, if I tell you that how great my pizza was this afternoon, but if I tell you it was great because what it did to me or what it reminded me of, that's interesting. And I think the best food writing does that. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, this is very interesting. Other question, please? Oh, Chiara, please. Okay, good. Thank you.
What do you think about contemporary literature of food compared with the food literature of the past? Because I think today many people speak about food, but only because it's a trend and they're not so passionate about this amazing world. I think, well, maybe I want to say it's like this. I would compare it to things like music or art, etc. Music is not me easy. Often people are saying like, oh, the music in the 60s and 70s was so much better, you know, Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, etc. And nowadays you listen to the radio and it's full of nonsense. But the point is, we still listen to Led Zeppelin and the Beatles because they were really good. There was a lot of nonsense on the radio in the 1960s as well. Or in the charts and whatever. And I think it's possible the same thing about food literature today and in the past, and food literature from the past. we still read MFK Fisher, who wrote in the 1940s, because she was so good. Whereas nowadays, there's so much noise, maybe. It's harder for us to actually, as contemporaries, to find the good stuff. And there's maybe also more out there. So I think the problem is that we just come across, yes, it's trendy and people, you know, everybody thinks they have something to say, but I think the good stuff will prevail. It's just maybe harder to find them right now because, especially, you know, with the invention of blogging, everybody has a voice. So maybe, yeah, that's what I would say about that. I'm an optimist.
Okay, thank you. Audrey, please. Good.
If I had to recommend one book that represents food and literature, which would it be? I think it's a personal favorite, but I would say, well, for food writing, I would say MFK Fisher and the Gastronomical Me. It's definitely, it's in terms of food writing and literary food writing, it's really one of the top things there. I'm talking about primary, not scholarly literature. I hope that's what you mean. Otherwise, there's a lot of interesting. There's a lot. Yeah, I mean, if it's novels or etc., it's hard to pick one. It's really hard to pick one. But if you're interested in following up with food writing, MFK Fisher is great. And if you're, I would also recommend there's an anthology, the Norton Anthology of Food Writing, called Eating Words, the Norton Anthology of Food Writing, by Susan Gilbert and Roger Porter. And they've collected a great selection of food writing. And not just, well, some of them are the greatest hits sort of thing, MFK Fisher is there, Michael Pollan's in there, but they also have Tolstoy and others. So they breach like classical literature and modern food writing. So if you're interested in this, I'd say start there. It's a rich selection. It's called Eating Words, the Norton Anthology of Food Writing.
Yeah, very interesting. No, it's a specific sector of food that is regional respect to that conference. No, it's very important. This aspect is to possible to take a course. No,
yeah, it's food writing has been studied. I mean, just the type of food writing, like with restaurant reviews, etc. But it's often been studied sort of from a sociological point of view, which is great, but it's just not the same thing, or rhetorics or things. But literature, does something else, as I tried to explain at the beginning. So I think we're only at the beginning. I mean, I'm specifically looking at Irish literature for my PhD. So I've looked at poetry, and the next step is to look at prose fiction. And once you start looking, you just find it everywhere. And I remember, and I'm in no way, I barely know anything about Italian literature, but I remember in the masters we had somebody who talked to us about Pinocchio, for example, or some other, poet, Italian poetry, and it was amazing. Once you start looking, you really discover very rich layers of food in writing. It's a real pleasure to. I love my job. Hope this is clear.
No, yes, it's very interesting. Do you know some also the Italian literature about food? You studied in the past, or? Sorry, Asia is another question.
I'll write the name of the books in a second. Yeah. So the Italian literature, I don't know enough. I would have to. I'm sorry. I would embarrass myself. But I remember Pinocchio was definitely something, and then there was also Italian immigrants to America, but I don't remember. I'm sorry. I focus so much.
Yeah, no, it's not possible to know all naturally, because it's very specific. In Asia is another question about.
Yeah, I'm just gonna I'm just going to write the names of the two books I mentioned. So there was MFK Fisher, The Gastronomical Me, and then the other one is Eating Words, the Norton Anthology of Food Writing. Definitely a great place to start. And the Norton Anthology is, I mean, it's a paperback book. It's not, you know, hugely expensive, and MFK Fisher anyway. So if you're interested in this, is very good. No problem. And I'd say from there you can branch out very much. Susan Gilbert also has another book called The Culinary Imagination. It's sort of a historical look at food writing. You will come out with a long list of a long reading list as well. So maybe also a good place to start.
And Anke, do you think about the recipe books? It's very.
Well, this is, you see, the thing is that recipe books and cookbooks and things like this are I don't look at them in my PhD because they don't have enough narrative. If they have a long introductions, they might fit into it, but recipes themselves different. But there's also, like, we have a in the masters that I teach here in the university in Dublin, there's a module called Reading Historic Cookbooks, and it's a systematic way of reading cookbooks, and there's beautiful work done in this area as well by Barbara Ketchum-Wheaton, etc. So it's a very interesting, and there's a lot of information and cultural knowledge embedded in recipes. It's just that I can't. I just, for my PhD, I have to make a choice, and yeah. So, food and symbolism. Well, okay. So Mikael is asking about food and symbolism. Where would I start with that? Well, I think it's kind of broad, the question. I'm not sure, because I would say if you start actually with the culinary imagination and look at her bibliography, the culinary imagination is she's an English professor, and she kind of goes in and out of symbolic views and sort of this gastrocritical views. But is it any specific thing you're interested in symbolism? I'm not sure. I don't have something like a good answer, like a brief answer for you to there. And Erica, it's interesting, and you were talking about Italian literature. I don't know. I'm sure this is a good example, but maybe Paolo can. Do you know Guido Gozzano?
Paolo? Yeah. It's a poetry. Yes, it's very. Okay. I understand. But in effect, there are many books that treats about food with relation with. And for example, not only is norm in novel, but also in the yellow book in Galli. Yeah. For example, Nero Wolf. Nero Wolf is there still the important people, no? The most important people in that novel is a very passion for food. And then it's very interesting to present recipe, etc. But also there are many examples about Italian literature about food. And then it's very interesting because a friend of mine suggested me some years ago to write a book with him about this relationship between. Yeah, but it's very important to have time for this. But in the future, it's possible that to write about this, and this is possible, for example, to have to do the thesis, no, of degree about this. Is very interesting.
I would suggest as well, like, I mean, sometimes I'm when you ask questions, sometimes when you ask me which restaurant is good in Dublin, I forget every single restaurant. So maybe I think of something. I was thinking that I might send Paolo, if I can send you a list, like a bibliography I have a list of books that are important for food and literature. So maybe I can send you a document in the next few days, and you can share it with the students. So Miko, maybe there's something there that fits your interest. I just right now there's not one that comes to mind. Maybe that's if Paolo doesn't mind sharing.
Yes, no, it's very interesting. It is, but it's very interesting. This too. The concept is in which way the food is represented in literature is very interesting.
Yeah, I
What
mean, people
probably
have to...
is now is to many differences between ancient literature and modern literature and contemporary literature, because it's different styles, no?
Yeah, there
Very
is. You can say, you know, you can see differences as well, because as like it has to do with sort of the worldview outside of literature. You know, as I try to say, with the modern era, for example, humans really become the measure of all things. So there's a lot more talking about, you know, humans and their relationship to nature, which wasn't so much a a thing in the Middle Ages. They talked a lot more about feasting and fasting and things like this, because that was just, you know, the spiritual aspects were so much more important in medieval times, and then in mythological times, different again. So yeah, I think there's in the same way that if you study literature, you usually focus on different eras because you know, they have different styles, etc. I think it would be interesting to compare this as well, to see like food in modern times in literature versus food in medieval times. But I think we've only skimmed the surface with literary food scholarship. So maybe in the future somebody will actually pick this up as well.
okay. Yes, thank you. And other questions? And then anche I think that for your work you must read many romance, many novels, or no? Do you
Not
like?
yet, not
Do you like
enough.
literature? Eh?
Yes, yeah. I mean, having studied it in my undergraduate degree certainly helps, but I feel like this. Whenever I constantly extend my reading list, basically my to-do reading list. So there's still a lot to discover.
And
Yeah.
in your department is considered important your research about this relationship between food and literature. It's very important.
Well, I am really an outlier. Is like literature itself is a specialized. Nobody else is really doing that in my department, because I mean my department really, the undergraduate is about teaching, like we train chefs basically, but we do teach them about gastronomy and food culture from the very beginning. So the idea of gastronomy and food and culture is important in our department. Literature is, as I said, is my specialization, but I am teaching a module on food writing, food and literature, food writing, including creative writing, a creative element, but also studying literature in our master's program. We have a master's on gastronomy and food studies, so that's included in that. So, well, hopefully in the future, maybe I can extend it and make this more important in our department. At the moment,
Okay.
it's one part of the mosaic of many other
And
other
are you
places.
writing any articles or review about or a book about this?
My second article on Seamus Heaney is going to be out in January, I believe. It's in the Folk Life journal.
Okay.
And then, as I'm progressing with my PhD, I hope to publish a
Okay.
few more papers on the way, and then I'm already in the back of my head, I'm already planning the book that is going to come out of it. But you know, one thing at a time. But there's definitely, yeah. I mean, between a general book on this, I definitely would like to study more on, you know, different parts like poetry or the Irish background, or a collection of Irish food writing as well. There's many opportunities and things that I would like to achieve in the future. Yeah, but the PhD has to come first.
Okay. Then thank you very much, Anke.
Thank you for inviting
and stay in touch with our university,
yes, absolutely.
because it's very interesting to stay possible collaboration about this interesting relationship between food and literature. And good luck for your career, and see you later, okay?
Thanks very much. Thank you guys. Thanks for joining.
Good evening. Ciao,
bye -bye.
grazie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Saluti a tutti, buonasera, good evening. Ciao.